World leaders gather in Rio de Janeiro for the annual G20 summit. European Central Bank Vice President warns high sovereign debt could hinder long-term growth. And China's general public budget revenue rises 5.5% year-on-year in the first 10 months of 2024. Good evening and welcome to the Economic Bulletin, where we present a comprehensive coverage and expert insight on the latest economic trends and developments. We start off our coverage of the annual G20 summit with world leaders that are gathering in Rio de Janeiro in the midst of a shifting global dynamic, particularly following the return of US President-elect Donald Trump. Heads of state arrived for the two-day meeting. The agenda tackles climate change, global trade, and international security. The Rio G20 Leaders Summit is being held under the theme Building a Just World and a Sustainable Planet between 18th and the 19th of November of this year. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on G20 nations to leverage their influence in addressing urgent global challenges such as climate change and conflict resolution. Guterres pointed out that the G20, which represents 85% of the global economy and is a major source of funding for multilateral development banks, plays a crucial role in steering climate finance.
And they have come to Rio with a simple message: G20 leaders must lead. And G20 countries, by definition, have tremendous economic clout and they yield massive diplomatic leverage. They must use it to tackle key global problems.
US President Joe Biden has announced a $4 billion pledge over the next 3 years to replenish the World Bank's International Development Association fund aimed at the world's poorest countries. This came during a speech at the G20 summit. The amount exceeds the $3.5 billion that Washington committed in the previous International Development Association replenishment round in December 2021. Biden also expressed pride in their country's efforts to mobilize private capital at scale, highlighting the achievement of raising $60 billion through the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. During a COP29 news conference, COP29 President Mukhtar Babayev stressed the G20's importance, saying that its leadership is essential to making climate finance progress.
The G20 will be meeting later today in Brazil. They account for 85% of global GDP and 80% of emissions. Their leadership is essential to making progress on all pillars of the Paris Agreement, from finance to mitigation and adaptation. We cannot succeed without them, and the world is waiting to hear from them. We urge them to use the G20 meeting to send a positive signal of their commitment to addressing the climate crisis. We want them to provide clear mandates to deliver at COP29. This is their chance to show their leadership.
The G20 has annually rotating presidencies. Brazil holds the G20 presidency from December 1st, 2023 to November 30th, 2024. Initially, the G20 focused mainly on general macroeconomic issues, but expanded its agenda to include topics such as trade, sustainable development, health, agriculture, energy, the environment, climate change, and the fight against corruption.
In the vibrant city of Rio de Janeiro, the G20 summit is hosting the globe's most powerful economies, who are convening to tackle the most pressing challenges of today. This year's summit features a bold call to action for a fairer, greener, and more inclusive world. Under the banner of building a just world and a sustainable planet, the summit has put transformative ideas on the table. One proposal turning heads is the introduction of a global tax on billionaires. Imagine this: a minimum 2% levy on the fortunes of the world's wealthiest could fuel initiatives to reduce inequality and combat climate change, potentially rewriting the rules of global development. But the path to consensus is not without hurdles. Argentina has raised objections to parts of the agenda, including taxation and gender equality measures, creating uncertainty about whether a unified communique can be achieved. Meanwhile, the return of Donald Trump as U.S. president casts a long shadow over proceedings. His promises to revisit trade tariffs and withdraw from climate commitments could reshape the future of international cooperation. Despite these challenges, the summit stands as a beacon of hope. From addressing global hunger to advancing clean energy, the G20 remains a critical platform for shaping the economic and social landscape of tomorrow. As the world watches, Rio's summit could mark a turning point of how nations collaborate to confront the shared trials of our time. Will this gathering deliver the bold commitments the world so desperately needs?
Joining us today to talk more about G20 and its impact on the global economy is international political economist, Mr. Benny Koch. Thank you, sir, for joining us here on Q News.
Thank you very much.
First, let's start off by asking a broad question. What is the significance of the G20 summit in light of the current global events?
Thank you for inviting me. So I would say for this year, the G20 is very important because it is now, because of the Donald Trump became another term of the U.S. president. But different from the Trump 1.0 for the Trump 2.0, the major difference is because the China and the U.S., the relations between the two countries deteriorates a lot. And that means around the world, the global political crisis is the risk of the geopolitical crisis is getting higher than 8 years or 4 years ago. And also the Ukrainian crisis, the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. So there are so many geopolitical risks around the world that, of course, it theoretically need the cooperations between China and the U.S. to solve the problems. But it seems we saw no solutions because of both countries, their relations is getting worse and worse.
Okay, so you touched on the idea of geopolitics, and this obviously has a role to play, not just when it comes to diplomacy and politics, but it also affects the global economy as a whole. So, what role does the G20 summit play when it comes to addressing global economic challenges such as inflation and recession, given the many geopolitical aspects that enter into it?
For the 320 arena, I would say for the because the Joe Biden is going to leave the office, so I guess the general or the audience around the world and investors would put more attentions on China. So that means Xi Jinping. How would Xi Jinping would propose is the China-led globalization order that is to try to attract or the investors or other leaders around the world that the globalization is good, inclusive trade is good, to try to portray America that is to forcing the mercantilism, protectionism is not as good. It's not good to the global economy. So I would say the Xi Jinping would take this chance to try to persuade to the general public around the world and the global leaders to try to persuade them to still trust the globalization, to still open the border, to do more free trade. Of course, the reason, the rationale behind this is that China has to be one of the major leader around the world, and it seems the president-elect Donald Trump is going to have to challenge this agenda that is proposed by Xi Jinping. So I would say for this G20 summit, yes, the Xi Jinping China is going to be the focus, and people would try to think whether what the Donald Trump would react after this
Yes.
G20. Yes.
Well, sir, you talked about, a change in administration and all of that, and obviously this is something that concerns the global community in general. So, what are your expectations or are your expected roles when it comes to the G20 summit in supporting economic stability in the next period, given, the pledge that President Joe Biden gave during the G20 summit of $4 billion to the World Bank? Is this preemptive as the incoming president-elect Donald Trump comes into office?
I would say yes, because Joe Biden is still committed to this, what we so-called the global governance. That is, of course, to strengthen the U.S.-led world order, and also because it is what Joe Biden and the previous U.S. administrations believe that is the U.S. has to do more on to strengthen the global governance. And it is because we all know the Joe Biden's got only 2 more months in the office, and it is what he could do in his last 2 months. So we don't know whether Donald Trump would what we would do since he take his office again in next year in January. Maybe he would leave maybe choose one of the world organizations to leave. We don't know, but at least for what the Joe Biden now is doing to do what he believes and before he leaves the office.
Okay, my final question here for you, sir, is in your opinion, what are the key outcomes that are anticipated to come out from this year's summit?
I would say that for this year's summit, except other than the Xi Jinping would propose his the China-led globalization order, and also we could have we could try to focus on whether the so-called the global South countries that is led by the India, Brazil, or maybe Southeast Asia and other developing countries, what they are going to propose and how they are going to force the developed countries to do more to help the global South to avoid for example, like hunger, the food crisis, or even the debt, and also, of course, the climate change.
Okay, thank you for joining us, international political economist Mr. Benny Kwok. Thank you so much for joining us here on Q News. And still in G20 and on the sidelines of the G20 summit, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva have signed a joint statement marking the elevation of their bilateral relations to a strategic partnership serving both nations' interests and aspirations. This came during a meeting between the two presidents where they discussed strengthening bilateral ties, tackling economic challenges, and advancing the priorities of developing nations. President el-Sisi expressed his gratitude for Brazil's invitation to the summit, calling it a testament to Egypt's strategic importance in both the Middle East and Africa. The Egyptian president is expected to address pressing global economic challenges at the G20 summit with a particular emphasis on the priorities of developing nations. Moving to Europe, the European Central Bank Vice President Luis de Guindos has warned that high levels of sovereign debt could prevent governments from addressing long-term economic challenges and consign them to low growth. Speaking at the Euro Finance Week in Frankfurt, Guindos said swelling primary budget deficits that push debt loads higher could result in a lack of spending room to tackle climate change, defense spending, digitalization, and subpar productivity. He added that fiscal slippage or questions around fiscal consolidation paths could trigger further repricing of sovereign risk, and that the current large primary deficit will also make it harder for governments to support the economy if adverse shocks materialize. Josep Borrell, the European Union's foreign policy chief, has indicated that the European Union is exploring the possibility of stopping the purchase of goods manufactured in the occupied Palestinian territories. This move is part of a broader discussion regarding the EU's stance on the ongoing war on Gaza. Borrell also emphasized the need for stronger international pressure on both Israel and Hamas to stop the war in Gaza, stressing that all forms of pressure must be applied to achieve ceasefire and halt the violence.
And if not, anyone will do whatever they believe is according with the need to support Ukraine.
Now we move to Asia, where the Bank of Japan Governor Kazuo Ueda has indicated that the timing of any future interest rate hike will hinge on the country's economic performance, especially wage-driven inflation. Ueda emphasized that the bank must gradually reduce its stimulus measures, warning that keeping real interest rates too low for an extended period could spur inflation more than anticipated. He noted that while there are various uncertainties, the bank would not necessarily wait for these to fully resolve before adjusting rates. Ueda explained that the timing of any change to the bank's monetary policy will be determined by the evolving economic, price and financial conditions. He added that the central bank would evaluate these factors at each meeting before deciding on any adjustments. Official data showed that China's general public budget revenue rose 5.5% year-on-year in the first 10 months of 2024, reaching 18.5 trillion yuan. Meanwhile, national budget expenditure climbed 2.7%, totaling 22.1 trillion yuan, focusing on key sectors like public welfare. Local governments issued 3.9 trillion yuan in special bonds, nearing full issuances, funding over 30,000 projects to support economic and social stability. And in the Middle East, data from the Joint Organization Data Initiative released shows that Saudi Arabia's crude oil exports reached their highest level in 3 months in September. Exports increased by 80,000 barrels per day, rising to 5.751 million barrels per day from 5.671 million barrels per day in August. As the world's largest crude exporter, Saudi Arabia's production, however, decreased slightly, falling to 8.975 million barrels per day from 8.992 million barrels per day in the previous month. Meanwhile, crude through output at Saudi refineries grew by 35,000 barrels per day, reaching 2.756 million barrels per day, and direct crude burning dropped by 296,000 barrels per day to 518,000 barrels per day. Turkey will discontinue state electricity subsidies for high-consumption residential and commercial users starting February. According to the official gazette, the decision applies to households consuming over 5,000 kilowatts per hour annually and industrial users exceeding 15,000 kilowatts per hour per year. However, agricultural consumer places of worship, charities and disaster relief organizations will remain exempt. Energy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar stated that the changes affected roughly 3% of Turkey's 40 million residential electricity consumers, aimed to prioritize subsidies for those in genuine need. In the energy sector, Sinopec Core and Saudi Aramco have begun construction on a new refinery and petrochemical complex in the Fujian province of southeastern China. The project, which has an estimated cost of 71.1 billion yuan, is Saudi Aramco's second major refining and petrochemical joint venture with a Chinese state-owned oil company, highlighting its increasing collaboration with Chinese private sector firms. The complex will feature a refinery with a capacity of 16 million metric tons per year. The complex is expected to begin operations in 2030 and will have an annual production capacity of 5 million tons of petrochemical feedstock. Oil prices edged up as concerns about fuel demand in China and forecasts of a global oil surplus weighed on markets. Brent crude futures were up 0.87% to $71.66 a barrel. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude futures were up 0.75% at $67.52 a barrel. Goldman Sachs projects gold prices will hit a record $3,000 per ounce by December 2025, driven by central bank purchases and U.S. interest rate cuts. Analysts emphasize gold as one of the top commodity trades for 2025, citing a robust official sector buying and potential inflows into exchange-traded funds as the Federal Reserve eases monetary policy. Goldman's has also noted that risks in other commodities. Brent crude oil is forecast to trade between $70 and $85 per barrel in 2025, with potential price spikes if the Trump administration enforces stricter sanctions on Iran. Gold prices rebounded after posting losses in the previous 6 sessions as investors await comments from Federal Reserve officials for clarity on the interest rate trajectory. Spot gold rose 1.3% to $2,593.32 per ounce. U.S. gold futures were up 1.1% at $2,597.80. And that brings us to the end. We move to the headlines, where world leaders gather in Rio de Janeiro for the annual G20 summit. World leaders gather in Rio de Janeiro for the annual G20 summit. European Central Bank Vice President warns high sovereign debt could hinder long-term growth. And China's general public budget revenue rises 5.5% year-on-year in the first 10 months of 2024. That's all for now. This brings us to the end of the economic bulletin. Stay connected for more news and updates here on Qnews.